in the last week or so, since we first discussed this, a number of parties have come forward lodging questions and concerns about where this is going. The UK has moved forward with its bill, and that's raised some concerns in that jurisdiction. What we're seeing here in Australia is 30 public sector agencies such as Centrelink, Medicare, ATO and so on, getting together under this trusted digital identity framework. That's the full name for it, and the key word there is trusted, in case you didn't trust it. Yeah. And moving towards an online world where you can be identified. Now, there are good reasons which are always put forward for that, Nick, you know, which is we want to make sure we're dealing with you and not somebody else claiming to be you. And so there are some, you know, logical foundations for it as we've moved more and more online. But there are implications from a risk point of view, but also from an efficiency and practical point of view, which we'll talk about briefly. I mean, the fundamental question is why? Well, why? Because we want to be more efficient as a government. Yeah, I can maybe understand that. Fraud. Yep.
I get that, and you can see that it's been moving that direction, right? We've had YouGov.
This has been going on for some while.
Whatever the different.
Yeah, I mean,
a lot of different digital
They
systems.
Announced this program.
Your health, my health.
Yeah, your health, my
health.
Your neighbour's health.
That's right.
In October last year, they announced this. You know, when everybody was focused on COVID and so on, they announced the program and gave it roughly a year. However, the issues around practicality is like, if you don't have good internet access, if you don't have a smartphone, if you maybe have an accent when you deal on the phone for voice recognition, if there are some practical things which reduce your ability to deal digitally, or if you're just older and you don't know how to do that stuff, then you get shut out of that digital economy. But also, and this is the troubling point in terms of the ethics of this, if I can be shut out of a football stadium or a cricket stadium because I haven't been, you know, I don't have the necessary vaccine status, then I can be denied service online very quickly if they can't locate me, my identity that is, or if my identity has accrued some black marks, a la social credit scoring. That's where this can go. I mean, I'm not saying it's going there now, but we'll get to that. But there are some practical things, and they're practical. The first fundamental is that this is a government project, $600 million to date and spending. They do not have the capacity or the inherent skills to pull this off, and I think that's your concern, right?
Well, my concern is, look, immediate concern at least is, can they really do it? Are they really competent for doing this?
I trust the government.
Well, I mean, they called it the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, so obviously it's trustworthy, and I'm wondering why they don't put trusted now in front of all of the other government agencies, because obviously they're not trustworthy, otherwise they would say that they were explicitly. Just can they actually pull it off? Is it something the government's competent for? And we've seen them try and roll out other things in the past. It concerns me that they look at all the different government bureaucracies and they go, you know, they look at Centrelink and how it's functioning and the taxation office, all of these different departments that have to interact with us, and they say we could solve their problem if only we could identify people. Like, they think that's where the problem is. And the problem is they're too big and complicated. Their rules are complicated. It's because they just accumulate regulations and legislation. The problem isn't really the efficiency of system. And there is a myth here that dehumanizing a system makes it more efficient. That's in engineering, we actually learn about that. Automation isn't some magic bullet. It just shifts.
And this was my point before. Nick's picked up on this myth. Like, if I can't get online, if I can't identify myself, or for some reason my files aren't complete, I have no visibility on that, right? I have no transparency, it's very opaque, then I'm denied service. Well, what if I can't get my Centrelink payment? What if I can't get my access to a service of some sort, medical service? What happens? Well, then you ring up, but then you can't talk to anybody.
Anyone who's tried to deal with Centrelink for anything knows that it's a complete basket case. Like, it's very difficult to get anything out. It's difficult to get them to remember what they did for you. And
well, I spoke to somebody.
You'll get ordered 7 years later, and they'll try and.
I spoke to somebody the other day with a custody-related issue and some payments through Centrelink, and they were on the phone for 2.5 hours. Yeah. And then finally, the identity profile that they had in the database was not complete, and they wouldn't allow that to go through, the payment to go through, and the change in the status in that particular case, because the identity was not right. Now, nothing had changed, but their data, their database wasn't, and you know, complete. So he was denied service, didn't get satisfaction, 2.5, 3 hours. That's not efficient on his, on his account.
No, and do they really think automating it makes that more efficient? Removing humans from the equation? Humans are capable of improving. Humans are capable of problem solving. Computers don't do that.
No.
And so you just actually systematise the problem with computers.
So we're talking to the efficiency and the practicalities of this.
Yeah.
And the government's ability to pull this off. 30 agencies, 600 million, and then sharing that data out to the private sector. And by the way, this will be outsourced to the IBMs of the world who specialise in identity management and in data warehousing and all that sort of stuff. So there will be a lot of private sector. So the trusted parties are people that we don't necessarily deal with directly, but will have access to the data. And people will say, well, they already do have access to your data if you're dealing with Google or Apple or whatever, and that's probably right. So it's now just the ripples are going out, yeah? But will it actually help you? Probably not. And this is the argument, that this is really an efficiency drive, an automation drive, and that doesn't necessarily bring benefits to the end user. And my argument would be, you know, the other risk, that's the immediate risk, right?
Yeah, immediate risk is that they screw it up.
Yeah. And the longer term risk is more nefarious, a bit more clandestine, which is, where is my data? Who has access to the data? Do I know who they know? I don't. Can I trust them? Well, I can't trust them because I don't know who they are.
And I think the scary thing there is the conjunction between something like this, which makes it more and more easy for the government to monitor individuals, know what individuals are doing. The conjunction of that and another trend, which is ideas like hate speech, which is an idea of thought crime, really, that you can think something and that's not the right thing to think.
Hate speech is anything that I hate. So I'm going to determine what hate speech is. And I'm going to apply it to your file, potentially retrospectively, down the track.
Yeah,
so I could then say,
it's adjudicating our ideas.
I could scrutinise your file back in 2020 and determine that you are now guilty of hate speech based on a current paradigm.
Based on something.
And deny you service.
Yeah.
Right, because I've got you mapped, I've got your identity, I know your activities.
And it's bad enough when the private sector and big tech are doing things like that off their own bat, but when the government is involved in that, it makes it more dangerous. And the more tools we give the government to actually monitor the individual and trace things to the individual, it's dangerous, and it ends up
so
in
this goes back,
credit,
this goes
it
back
ends up
to,
in censorship.
well, it does. Well, potentially it does. It does in other countries. And this goes back to the fundamental question: is why? I mean, why would a government want this? Well, they can promote on, you know, efficiencies and economies and streamlining services and integrating services. You have one profile with government, but now they're talking about integrating private sector. Now we saw this with the vaccine mandates late last year, where the Prime Minister said we won't have vaccine mandates. And the National Cabinet, so-called National Cabinet, they end up with 4 categories, right? And the first category was frontline workers, and category 3 was basically everybody in retail and, you know, related services. So the supply chain cascade very quickly picked up category 3. So going forward, I could say to you, well, you can't deal with me, I'm a private sector provider, because you don't have a digital identity. And you go, but you're not the government. I said, no, but that's kind of what I've signed into now. So I deny
I'll buy into it, I'll use their system to...
Well, I have to, because they put pressure on me, because I'm supplying government here. So I've had to do what we saw this with the health department, right?
Yeah.
And so you couldn't go on site to a government building, or you couldn't provide services. So there was a cascade through the supply chain.
Yeah, and I think part of the point you're making is they're calling it opt-in as well. You know, you can opt in to this, and that's just whatever. Because opting out is going to come at significant personal cost to a system that everyone is obliged to.
But if I'm a commercial provider, I am going to opt in, because I can't afford to opt out.
Exactly.
I can't afford to miss out economically. So I'll opt in, and then I'll put the pressure down. So they're using the supply chain again. It worked in vaccine mandates. It's going to work again here. So I'm not suggesting this is conspiratorial now. There is an immediate risk in functionality and practicality and efficiencies and wastage, but there's a longer term risk.
It's a risk.
There is a real risk there. And we've seen it happen in other countries, notably China and European countries. starting to. It could happen here. So in 3, 4, 5 years,
That's
if
right.
there's, and by the way, this is a centralised database, right? So with the internet and the whole online thing is about decentralised, but here we go, a central bucket of data, correlated data, mapping people's activities 360 degrees, and then integrating that, and they can, and they already do to a degree, with social behaviours, social media, and saying, okay, we now know who you are, and then we can apply, if we so choose, they may not, but if they so choose, it's another small step to say, well, we can actually now limit or deny you a service. That's the longer term risk, and that's why the the trusted digital identity framework may not be so trustworthy as we like to think. And in the UK especially, and in New Zealand and in Australia, people are getting very, very concerned about it, and I think we need to monitor this, and there are some people already starting to put their cases forward and bring their concerns to the table. They've asked for submissions, they've had those submissions, and they're moving this forward. So once the election is through, whomever wins that election, we'll see this, I believe, start to really advance.
One of the topics we've been talking about, of course, is censorship. And this week, a really interesting news item that doesn't directly relate to that, but I think ultimately it will. Elon Musk purchased
not Elon again.
Elon, good old Elon. I like Elon Musk. Elon Musk's one of these guys, some people like him a lot of the time, don't like him a lot of the time, always extreme, and it's because he's an independent thinker. And so he doesn't just knee-jerk with one group or the other. He thinks what he wants to think about topics. But look, he's purchased the lion's share, the largest share, which is still less than 10%, but the largest share
9.2
of Twitter. Yeah, it's something like 9.2% of Twitter shares, which means he's their largest single
And he's
shareholder.
going on the board. And he's going on the board.
Yeah. And so really significant news item, because something that we had been seeing was alternatives. The idea that, no, well, maybe we just need to provide the alternatives. You had Parler, you have Gab, you have Rumble, and with varying degrees of success. The problem I always had with Parler is the point of Twitter, it is a place for everyone to share with one another. It's a public square, and you can't solve this public square censorship by having two public squares. One of them's right wing, one of them's left wing. If anything, it makes the problem worse. And I think that, of course, Parler then faced problems. You know, they got essentially removed from the internet. Every single part of their service provider down the chain kicked them off, and they couldn't get support. And so then they were saying, well, we need a whole entire parallel economy. We're going to have our own servers. We're going to have our own internet providers.
Control our pipes.
Yeah, control every aspect of the entire supply chain and have a parallel economy. And I don't like that solution, because it just...
Why not?
It splits everything into two. It's dividing the country into two when we actually want to solve it by uniting.
But I would argue that they've divided the country into two already. So the division,
Well, that's
the
right.
division,
The
has
division is
occurred.
through the censorship. But see, I think that what Elon Musk has done represents a better solution, which is fight. We are a large portion of the population. Like approximately 50% of people are roughly
This is
right-wing.
consistent with your political strategy, which is to become part of the
Be
party.
involved,
Be involved.
actually be involved. And so if Elon Musk, by buying shares in Twitter, can now say, look, I want us to revisit this Twitter censorship policy. We need to be a First Amendment company that stands on free speech, and he's got the power to do that. I think that we assume that we don't have the power to actually be involved, but for some reason think we've got the power to create our own parallel economy. No, fight, square on.
So don't abdicate, attack.
Yeah, and I think there's other places where we need to think about this, like superannuation, right? All the super companies have got their green policies and having a big influence throughout all the corporate world, and a lot of people going, I don't really want to be part of that. But you are, of course, if you have super. Well, start a super company. If a super company was started that said, we're a super company for conservatives, and if you put your super in us, we'll manage all the things for you, and we will invest in media. We're going to buy media shares left, right, and centre. We're going to invest in big tech. We're going to invest in big tech. We're going to invest in oil and gas companies and not put activists on the board. You know, we're actually going to invest in the things conservatives care about. I would move my super straight away.
The same thing's happening though in the US right now with Disney. I mean, Disney have gone feral, and they're trying to run Florida and put pressure on DeSantis. Now people are people are now pushing back on Disney and actually cancelling them, or suggesting they get cancelled. There are activist groups, in quite a few, in fact, in the US, who are established and funded to put pressure on conservative companies. This is the long march through the institutions. It's the institution of commerce and economy.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the same sort of thing. So the media is a huge space and it's so important, which is why we're doing this. And what you're suggesting, I think, is get back in the room and push back and fight. And he has the money to do that. The question will be, and I think the jury's out on this, it's current news, what will he do? Because he can flip and he can flop, Mr. Musk. You know.
I think on this, I think he'll be all right. But we certainly.
Or was it just a stakeholder play? Because the share price has already gone up in reaction to his news. He's already paid for, in effect.
He's put out some pretty promising tweets showing a very clear, principled stance.
And he's done this in the middle, right in the zone where Truth Social, Trump's project, is launching.
And see, I think
that's hit a few rocks.
Truth Social may be one of the first things Trump does that doesn't particularly work, because you just can't predict consumer behaviour when it comes to social media. We make on-the-moment convenience decisions a lot more than big principled
decisions. Even with 50 million base, they can't get on at the moment. That's the trouble. You know, they're having some.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's hard to predict. We'll see what happens.
I would like to see what Musk's intentions are, because he can be a little bit. Well, petulant, probably not the right word, but
I think on this he'll be solid. There's just little signs that show that he has a pretty good stance when it comes to freedom of speech and free thought. And as I said, I think it's because in large part he's a pretty free thinker, and he doesn't like going on shows for interviews, it seems, but he was happy to be interviewed by, of all things, the Babylon Bee. You know, big scoop for them, just a satire site, get to interview Elon Musk. And just the fact that he's supportive of them, they get censored left, right and centre. So I think that he'll be good for this. But I think he also reflects a different approach, which is don't believe that the left is as powerful or as influential as they think.
They're very noisy.
And they frequently overplay their hand. Like all the stuff currently about trans women in sport, right? That's something that is just so insane. The idea that someone who's spent most of their life riddled with testosterone, right? They've got Y chromosomes in every cell in their body, can go into a competition, compete against women, win, and say, I'm the fastest female swimmer in the world. It's absolutely nonsense. So many people are convinced of that. It's like there's a power of majority there. There's a power of common sense that can be wielded to say, no, just because they're the loudest doesn't mean they have to be.
What you're talking now, you've shifted topics a little bit here from Musk to the point of breach of tolerance. So there's been a tolerant, quiet, conservative bloc. That tolerance point has been breached, and people aren't tolerating as much. And that example you just gave, DeSantis has said no, give back the medals, and they're not going to win the race anymore. He's not going to accept it. So the tolerance point has been reached and pushed back. Musk will push back, we hope, with that, but other people need to do it. Pushing back in entertainment. I mean, Hollywood is kind of, nothing can save Hollywood.
I saw it as a ray of light, and I thought I never had much confidence in the parallel economy guys, but the idea that no, we can participate and win. I like that, and I think that there's a lot of scope for that and for that sort of thinking. And I would suggest people out there who have money to invest and things to do and want to think about how to do that.
Well, let's see what happens, because he's certainly got the money and he's paid for his shareholding already with the increase in the share price. And I'll be very keen to see what he actually does with that position. He's on the board, shortly to be appointed to the board. And boy, does America need it, that's for sure, and the world. We've mentioned New Zealand and their trusted digital framework. What we now find through a report from Chantel Baker is that the Ardern government is in fact quite advanced in their preparations for this digital identity world, and have been working on it over the last 4 to 6 months in particular, and now moving this through for consideration. They were doing this under the guise of the COVID mandates and lockdowns. Her report shows that the government will have the ability to enable or approve transactions. And by default, that means they can disapprove. And that should be concerning to just about everybody. It also targets online content, which you would expect. Take a look at this report.
But B, it talks about encouraging people to get vaccinated. This was going to be a stepping stone and a link to the Digital Identity Trust Framework, a piece of legislation that hadn't even passed its second or third readings, and it hadn't had the submissions heard by the public either. You may be wondering what the Digital Identity Trust Framework is that they reference this COVID pass being a stepping stone into. Now, the Digital Identity Trust Framework is a really interesting bill, and it does have a lot of corresponding information in there to people's concerns. And part of it is that it allows the control of our banking system. As you know, a lot of the ATMs around New Zealand have been closed. They're talking about going more into a cashless society. And unlike current cryptocurrency forms like Bitcoin and Ethereum, where it's non-centralized and the people own it, they're wanting to create a centralized banking system. Now, the G7 recently were talking about this, and they said that a centralized banking system, digital currency, a centralized digital currency would allow for things such as items to be bought that were government approved. What would it look like to get government disapproved? What if you spoke up and you said, hey, Jacinda may have lied to us about something, and they could shut off your banking like that? If they didn't bring in the COVID-19 vaccination certificates, I'm not sure how they would have managed to bring in the digital identity framework. The only thing I can think of is that they would have brought it in alongside a cashless society, phased out money, and made it that the only way that you can get access to your funding is if you go through this digital system. They definitely have used this as an opportunity to further the Digital Identity Trust Framework. And they have brought it in under the guise of just COVID-19 vaccination. Because what do you do when you want someone to do something that they've never done before? You've got to implement it in very small steps. You can't just go and change the entire process of something that they've been doing their entire life. And that's what we've seen with the COVID-19 certificates. It's got everyone online, it's got everyone digitalized, it's got them happy with segregation. And it's got them very, very, very compliant with the government's wishes. All of these things would not have happened in 2017. Not like that, and not with the majority of the population. But under the guise of health and safety, they've managed to push it through and create an incredibly compliant society.
In the UK, the Online Safety Bill went to Parliament in late March. That's a draft legislation of 134 pages, which some of the brightest legal minds couldn't really unravel or decipher. There are two key points to consider in that particular bill, and it's been promoted on the basis of, creating an online, safer world. Safety is the key word there, just like public health safety. The two key points are, first of all, there is both illegal and harmful content. What's illegal content? Well, that's terrorism, child grooming, pedophilia, abuse, that type of thing, which most people, if not everybody, would agree with. But there's card stacking therein, because what they also attach to that is harmful content. What's harmful content? Depends on your worldview, and it depends on the timing. What's harmful today may not be harmful tomorrow, or vice versa. What's harmful to me may not be harmful to you. So who determines what's harmful? Well, the government does. Who's the government? The people in the elected positions today and tomorrow and in the future. And this leads us to the second point. The second key point here is that the primary legislation which has been promoted and presented to the UK Parliament, once it is approved, that is in law, of course, and any subsequent revisions, if approved in the House, if put to the House and approved, cannot be amended. So what that means is the government of the day, maybe in a year or 2 or 3 years' time, if they put forward a revision to the bill, if they have the numbers and that goes through, that cannot be amended by the opposition. What does that mean? Well, in maybe 2025, let's say, hypothetically, the government wants to tighten the screws on harmful content, which is a very subjective and unqualified term, they can put through a revision, and if they have the numbers, that cannot be objected to and amended. So that's the kind of concern that people are actually flagging with these type of bills, and in Australia it's much the same. So whilst it has superficially some appeal in terms of fraud and protecting children online, that is how it's promoted. The devil's in the detail. I mean, there are vagaries in this. And in the UK, if they were truly concerned about those things, they would take down the dark web. They would limit Facebook's efforts and facilities in that area, not target the superficial web, as it's called, and actually tighten the screws on that. This is censorship long-term in another form. And once the bills are introduced in Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, there will be virtually no constraints on how those might be amended or adjusted over time. The online world used to be a decentralised, egalitarian, free-thinking world. The governments of the day and the governments of the next day don't want that to be the case.